What are these videos? How ought I to read them, listen to them, watch them, interpret them, understand them? Howdy y'all. We've new tools at hand, at our fingertips to be more precise about it. The questions of how to utilize them, what's their meaning, their meaningfulness, and how to write a writing with them are fairly different but not at all uninteresting sorts of questions. I want to firstly, and perhaps briefly, present these as a kind of philosophical experiment, which is factual and true. It was indeed a philosophical experiment. One conceived and implemented by and for a philosopher. Hence, I want to present its initial tailoring in an honest manner, without overly too much in the way of interpretations made after the fact. The point of the philosophical musing being quite literally and literarily, how can and do these new tools affect one's philosophical writings? Perhaps more generally, one's writings, but in particular, perhaps more due to the experimenter than anything else, perhaps not, the philosophical. And two, how do these philosophical musings affect these tools' winky face? What tools? These I mean through which yon gentler reader may be amusing themselves with. The internets, and more broadly speaking, the various AI and, less than AI, but still very deeply learning sorts of things that run the internets. How to train, teach, and interact with an AI system, or more precisely, a series of AI systems. Beyond some of the more obvious aspects thereof, I've grown to rather strongly suspect that there is another, historical sort of aspect that is of worth here, namely, that those born later than me in much of the world are not growing up without the internets. That is, they are broadly being immersed in the internets from the get-go, and hence they are being shaped by the AI and the less than AI systems thereof. What is true of the philosophical is likely to be applicable to the rest. That is, insofar as these various AI systems have been affecting my own writing, and insofar as my own writing has been affecting them, so too is it going to be the case that it can be effective upon others. And why philosophy? Gosh, I hardly even really think that deserves an answer. It seems almost a stupid question. But still, to answer, because it's always been philosophy. The academics of it all, they are all philosophy. The sciences, but a branch of the philosophies to study stuff in another manner. Such digresses far too far to be of use. Let's perhaps just muse with it, and play pretend that the philosophical disposition has a certain foundational quality to the discourses that matter in the moment. Methodologies matter for the matters of an experiment, and I must confess that my methodologies are almost certainly not up to the snuff in a laboratory. The notion was very much an in real-life sort of experiment, working in the fields rather than in a laboratory. Nonetheless, there was methodology involved. The working hypothesis broadly was and is that the various AI systems, these new tools we have, are interconnected not only to each other via each other, but also via their users, e.g. humans. That there is some non-insignificant degree whereby what humans do is thereby translated to the AI systems, and what the AI systems do in turn is likewise translated to the human-to-human systems. The AI systems utilize information derived from the humans utilizing them, not only as broad groups, but also as individuals. The fact that the folks developing these AI systems are selling information about the humans as a means of exactly developing these systems is hardly controversial. I am merely noting that such is the case, and thereby utilizing the tools thereof, rather than merely being subjected to them. Moreover, it was well understood that all the AI systems would be programmed by humans, and many or most would have very specific biases to them, e.g. biases towards the making of money for various humans, more broadly towards the distribution of monies. Importantly too, biases towards various social groupings, but, and this is important to note, as much as I will be speaking of those kinds of biases, I do not think that those kinds of biases play a major role in the experiment. If for no other reason than that the experiment centered on me rather than a grouping as such. Still, I wouldn't dismiss those sorts of biases as being relevant in general, e.g. undoubtedly those biases are present within the AI systems, and to some degree or another within me too. I just am less than certain the degree of relevance they may have to the experiment. With that hypothetical framework in mind, among the kinds of things I was looking for are how aspects in real life may come forth relative to my own experiences online. That is, in the gross sense, how such things as cultural movements may occur online and then manifest themselves in real life, but also far more subtle things, personal things. As in, for instance, how I may be writing on some topic in a personal, private manner, and seeing how folks in real life may echo it. Such can of course be construed in a wide variety of ways, assuming of course that there is anything akin to that happening. I can merely report that there is some significant degree of that happening. The point of those kinds of observations is to note that they are happening on even very subtle scalars of actions. Another kind of thing I was looking at was how relevantly responsive the various AI systems are in presenting me with online material. Like most folks who have been online for a long while, the recognition of targeted advertising, listening devices that hear what you're talking about and give you ads related to it, etc., are common, and not particularly mysterious, if fairly disconcerting. Though I must add, as someone who's been online since before the younger generations were born, the ads used to be a lot more interesting, humorous, and relevant kinds of measurements as to what the AI systems thought I might be interested in, rather than merely blandly, kinda stupidly, and often accurately reflecting back at me something I may have said. Something to consider for everyone: targeted adverts are uninteresting adverts, to put it mildly. More than these kinds of obvious things, were the more subtle AI presentations. When you open a new tab, for instance, what are presented as possible options for things to see? When you open your YouTube or social media app, or when you look at a selection of reputable news apps, what music is suggested for you? Now, clearly all of these, again, are developed via humans writing script, each of which have priorities whereby they present the information to you. There isn't exactly a mystery there either in terms of the mechanics of how, beyond noting again the strikingly important point that all of these systems are developed in the real world, and all of these systems are already dynamically interconnected with the real world. They have effective form in the real world, in other words, and the real world has effective form upon it. So despite the knowing, broadly, as to the hows of how the AI are scripted, what their broad aims are, and so forth, there remains a lot of unscripted elements to the entire process, e.g. humans, and how humans are dynamically interacting with the various AI systems. Moreover, as a philosopher, how can I put this delicately, I consider stranger things than money concerns, than the concerns that is that most of the AI is concerning itself with. I do not write upon obvious sorts of things. To be blunt, the interpretations of what I am saying are rarely straightforward, and when they are oft misleading, idiosyncratic, and require the context of other kinds of writings to really comprehend what I am saying. For instance, there is poetry involved, embedded, within my philosophical writings, which may broaden the meaning of whatever else it was that I was saying, and so unless one is really paying careful attention, the wrong or misleading sort of interpretation may be taken. Likewise, I am oft responding within, to, and or through various well-established areas of philosophical, feministic, scientific, or mathematical thoughts. These are not introductory sorts of inquiries, in other words. Consider such the subtlety context of the experiment. A Boolean search engine just doesn't cut it, nor again does a keyword search exactly capture the meaning, essence, etc., of what I am writing on. By far among the most pertinent things I was looking for was a meaningful response in musical selection from the AI, that is, a musical response to my philosophical writings. A poetical response, in other words, to the various philosophical words I was writing on. If, when I open a new YouTube tab, would the musical selection include something of meaningful import to the philosophical text I was writing on or no? Would the AI present to me something of worth, additive worth even, to the context of the philosophical musings I had? How literal would it read things? Could it contextualize the things I was writing onto the events in the real world beyond me, and give it a musical score? In effect, I supposed that the various other humans interfacing with the internets provide the proper context for the AI systems to interpret the things I was writing on. Among the assumptions therein being that as a philosopher, while I may, and perhaps have, come up with novel content, that by and large philosophy is reflective of the reality, including the cultural reality that the philosopher is embedded with. Hence, whatever I was writing on ought to be reflective of the cultural reality. That it has a philosophical flair to it matters for a variety of reasons that I suspect make themselves more apparent via the writings themselves, though I also suspect that anyone that has studied philosophy in general would likely be able to surmise the reasons why. I haven't only used YouTube, I've also tried utilizing music services, Pandora and Spotify to the same ends. Partly the notion was to shift to differing AI platforms to see if the same kind of process would occur. I've also tried doing this with differing devices, e.g. the musical score playing on a device that is not the same as the one I was writing on. Just hitting a mix, or picking a starting song, and seeing what the AI spits up while I am writing, and definitely correlating it, not causation, to the writing. See how well it fit. Now, I say not causation, but then this is something of a lie, or at least, a bit of a slander to the whole thing. After all, the reality is that the whole affair is a causal sort of one. It may be complex, but nonetheless it is causal in its form. For instance, and importantly, when the song hits a certain lyrical point, it becomes infused within the writing, in no more mysterious a way than that I myself recognize the correlation and thereby via correlation the causation of the infusion to the writing occurred. I've a sneaking suspicion that the notion of causation is a wee bit too dependent upon the segregation of the individual from the systems they are studying, a disposition towards the fairly smaller scalar, narrower, more mechanical, and simplistic viewpoints. In other words, it clearly influenced me, and that influence and indeed the influence upon the AI are best understood as via correlative aspects. Moods, emotive modes, forms rather than strictly causal relations, at least not in the sense that that term is generally understood as. Such is not as outrageous a claim as it may seem, though it likely seems like a very outrageous sort of claim. The converse is likely clearly true, e.g. I clearly influenced it. None of that ought to be mysterious either. Again, such is the premise here. The AI systems are after all designed to exactly be influenced by us. The only odd question therein being the content upon which the influences were predicated, the context of the experiment that was being performed, and the capacity of each to influence the other beyond the mereness of the various programming, e.g. the dynamical sort of relationship that obviously occurs via the setup of the tool. It seems important to again and really make the point clear to the youngins, this kind of thing is new, it is novel, at the least in terms of its scale and manipulability. What they take for granted was most definitely not the case not that long ago. How these new things may be interfacing with something as foundational and fundamental as philosophy, and how we think, is of some significant importance, at least potentially. Moreover, it is also important to note that these things are not entirely new, novel, etc. That is, these kinds of influencing on scalarly different levels is not entirely new. The tools and means of doing so have shifted, but often it is the case in the before times that what folks refer to as voice, spirit, soul, etc., very well may refer to the sorts of things that take on a rather striking reality in the virtual online medium. Not, again, necessarily in any seriously mysterious sense, but in a rather straightforward sense of the capacity to actually capture and record en masse conversations of entire populations. Entire populations en masse have had conversations before, long before the advent of the internets, but they were never recorded, never referenced, save via the memory of people. What folks may have once upon a time referred to as being in the air, a very ephemeral sort of thing, may have a reality to it in the form of the written textual records we've been giving them. Similar can be understood in terms of longer-form conversations between lovers, friends, friend groups, online communities, etc. None of these would in any meaningful sense have been apparent to anyone in the before times, but which were nonetheless real existing things. Yet, consider carefully the reality of those times, whereby the belief was upon which such things rested, e.g. the belief that those broader scalar forms of such things as conversations had reality to them, effective form to them. The language may have shifted, but that towards which they referred may have not. For example, consider this general philosophical interpretation of the currents. The interrelation between the poetical and the philosophical, as well as what is discussed in the relevant lit, is held as something that always happens, rather than a purely academic sort of phenomenon. The tools have shifted, but the interrelation remains. The notion is that each style of discourse exists and is responding to the same sets of phenomenon, and also to each other. Such is a supposition held in the relevant Socratic dialogues discussing the arts, the poets, etc. The point though is that for folks who do not study philosophy, it is held that the same thing is going on, e.g. they are influenced in no small part via the musical, poetical they listen to, and through listening to such things, they thereby form their informal philosophical dispositions. They thereby set the stage, the emotive mood, whereby the philosophical dispositions can be embedded within, and vice versa. In some sense all I have done here is make it all very explicit, and utilized a new tool for doing so. Though tbh I think that sense of understanding is too minimalistic for understanding the writings as a whole. Beyond the musical as such, the poetical as a modality of discourse, transmission of ideas, etc., is very old. Oral traditions in general tend to utilize this stylistic format rather than specific, rationalistic, fact-based sorts of transmission of ideas, wisdoms, knowledge, etc. Likewise most, perhaps all the various relevant sacred texts utilize the poetical as an integral part of the writing. In a very real sense, a modality of understanding this is the mimetical discourse, that is, the discourse as it happens on a mimetic level. The poetical, in other words, is very likely being expressed, in essence, as a mimetical and hence too aesthetical sort of thing. When folks are transmitting memes, they are transmitting merimetical sorts of information that is most easily grasped aesthetically, poetically, rather than factually speaking, or even philosophically speaking. The point of mentioning this here is to somewhat demystify these pieces, be fairly transparent as I can be about what it is I am doing in these pieces, and indeed, what it is the species is doing via their utilization of the AI systems, mimetic discourse, and aesthetical kinds of understandings. From a philosophical perspective, I would strongly suggest that these mimetic, aesthetical sorts of communication constitute examples of the forms, the central Platonic, Socratic inquiry. They are base predicable cultural structures of thought, seats to a fractal thought structure. Which sounds an awful lot like the Platonic description of forms. It would be too much to hold that such is the totality of forms, or that the mimetic structures in the current are representative of the totality of forms, e.g. the totality of mimetic aesthetic structures. Still, the plethora of them in the current, their structure as cultural aesthetic expressions, and their capacity to move people all entail the importance for folks to get a hold of what they are doing. To the AI, and indeed to anyone who cares to keep such records and review them, there's a record of the entirety of the conversation, and within that, records of patterned forms. Patterns of thought, we can surmise, though there may be many distortions to them from a variety of influences. But consider the degree whereby just having the record at hand, the capacity to for instance look up what someone has said, really does have massive effective force upon the dialogue. It fundamentally shifts the dynamic of relationships, individually and en masse as a population, group, etc. Lies regarding what someone said, for instance, become far more difficult, which has a lot of pragmatic ramifications in the interpersonal lives of people and the broader scalarly relevant sorts of structures. Again, the presumption is that those kinds of broad effective forms upon the humans in turn, in dynamic relation with, the AI systems functionally iteratively creates markedly different patterns of human behavior, human thought, etc., patterns apparent in broader scalar form than such things as grammar, deductive reasoning, logical forms, patterns of poetic thought, conceptual processes, which are perhaps if not best at least very fully represented within such things as philosophy, poetics, faiths, and musics. There deserves to be some accounting given to the whole affair. This kind of thing is clearly going on. After all, there can hardly be any doubt on the matter at this point, though note there was deep doubt about such things when this experiment began, and interpretations of the currents of the reality do differ. Many of the finer aspects of this will be addressed via other pieces posted here and elsewhere. Let me say here though that the notion of the fusion of philosophical and poetical discourse is not exceptionally new. There is a significant record of the intertwining of these for some time now. I would direct the interested reader in the classic Socratic dialogues and the pre-Socratic philosophers for the earliest sorts of reference to the interconnection between art, music, thought, and philosophy, and indeed the deliberate separation of philosophy from the poetics at that time. The poetical's total absence from the scientific discourse is striking and noteworthy, though given so without comment. Nor on a personal level was it the case that all I did was this particular experiment regarding AI. Long before the curious case of the AI came along, the notion of intertwining the poetical and the philosophical was already on my table. Already I would take myself to the tasks of listening to musical musings of others, interpret them, and entwine them within my own philosophical musings via embedded lyrical use. Not really the quotation of the poetic, but rather a structuring of the philosophical point such that it would lead to the poetical point made via the lyric, especially the lyric as understood via the song as a whole. That particular technique of writing, of embedding and entwining the poetical with the philosophical, is its own sort of thing, but is strongly related to understanding the pieces presented here. One cannot really grasp at the point of what is being said without also having some sense of what the song is saying, and it is held that one cannot really grasp at what the song is saying without also having a sense of what the philosophical is saying. The point being that the correlative, the poetical musings, these are, after all, actualized modalities of thought, embedded within the philosophical discourses as presented. Folks who lean too heavily upon the one or the other will clearly miss the point of that to which they fail to lean. It'll simply float away. To give a nod to the currents of the reality, it is the case that these pieces can be understood as speaking to the poetical and philosophical import of selective selections of musical musings fused together via whatever the programming of the AI may be, and whatever the individual proclivities of me myself may be. Likewise far better understood as not merely me myself, but also the non-insignificant influences of the various humans around me in my life too. Still, these writings are my own creation. It can be tempting, in other words, especially for the youth, to look upon such musings as these with a bit of skepticism, as in, of course that is how music is, what more is there to say about it? And I mean, even setting aside my own generational differences, speaking of the significance of music throughout the human historical experience is a fairly profound topic itself. To hold to the casual blunt notion that of course this is how music is to really be ignorant of the paucity, beauty, and sublimity of the situation they find themselves within. I suspect, having lived within it myself, unimpressed, that folks are accustomed to it to the point of obliviousness about the magnitude of the situation. The degree whereby musical lore moves the human species, its thought, its ideas, its emotive states, and hence, too, its experiential reality is rather powerful, always has been, and has always been noted as such. Musical choice. It didn't seem fair to fuss too much over the musical choice. To not force the AI too much on the matters. But to give it some hints, and mostly to hold to the principle that if it were to play something for me it ought to be most relevantly held as coming through the philosophical discourse, rather than, say, my personal musical preferences. Hence, noteworthy, and indeed perhaps critically noteworthy, it is not the case, by and large at any rate, that the songs represented in the writing are reflective of my personal musical preferences. At least, not at the time of their initial playing. It is true that as they've become entwined within my philosophical writings, I've grown fonder of them. To be fairly clear on the point, it would have been a sign of poor interpretative skills of the AI if it merely fed me songs I knew, that I would have chosen myself. Oft enough the songs chosen are far flung from my personal tastes, and tbh my personal tastes in the before times were rather strikingly dark, very sad, heartbreaking really. Such musings of my own are surely sprinkled within the musical score to the philosophical discourses. But, critically, they are strikingly not merely reflective of musical tastes. Rather, in their poetics, their lyrical, oft enough in their evocative moods, they are reflective of the philosophical discourse as they were written. I mean by as they were written in a couple of senses. In a straightforward temporal dynamic sense, what songs arose as I was writing, sometimes with prompting, as in pulling up a new YouTube tab, or pressing play in a randomized playlist when I was ready. I also mean such in terms of the contents, the meanings of the writings and the poetical as they were written, via reading through and editing the philosophical aspects while deliberately incorporating the musical score as it so happened to be playing. Moreover, on a personal level I am and have been rather strikingly uninformed and uninvolved about pop cultural reality. Nor again have my proclivities leaned heavily into the various social currents of online public discourse. To be blunt and a bit snobbish about it, apologies, it was all just too lowbrow for me. Like, I tried it, and was thoroughly unimpressed. While I'm not entirely unaware nor uninitiated in the internet culture and the various online texts, the point therein being that in my personal life, and in my online proclivities, chasing after pop culture social cue balls was not a thing by which the AI systems would generally read of me. Hence their inclusion in the musical score is its own kind of interesting referent I leave to gentler readers to suss out. It was not the case that all my writing was online, and virtually none of it was public. Among the interesting aspects were the degree whereby the writing that occurred offline, handwritten pieces of which there are many, may also be reflected within the AI presentations to me. That is, when there is no obvious causal connectivity at all available. Keeping them private prevented them from influencing people. Keeping them offline entirely prevented them from influencing the AI. The only plausible modality of influences at that point being, well, such things as we are responding to the same sorts of phenomenon, rather convoluted chains of events, conspiracy theory, certain theories of divinity, or certain theories regarding the structure of reality, e.g. there is something aside from the obvious causal forces at play. Any of these gets into the woo-woo of theories, though that it is woo-woo isn't really a sufficient reason for its dismissal. Of these kinds of events, of which I have to say there were some, that is, events whereby there was no obvious causal relation between, say, my personal handwritten notes, and anything that would have happened in real life, there honestly is little to say. They happened, but by their very nature they defy evidence of the sort that folks who would doubt such things would accept, or even really much in the way of presentable presentations. On that point I want to be clear though, it isn't that they didn't happen, nor again that they lack evidence. It is rather bluntly that they lack the kind of evidence that people who would tend to doubt those things would accept. So there is little point in doing much more than pointing to them, saying they happened, and moving on. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you won't. I would confess that such things gave me cause to change my view regarding a variety of aspects of reality. A gentle reader, even a dubious sort of reader, that is, a doubter of things, a skeptic, is likely to be able to grasp at some of the evidentiary points throughout these pieces. Moreover, they may get a good sense of the reasoning and rational operati in play. But such is far and away too complicated to present here, or indeed, in any single piece. Watching every motion in this lover's game. I study love, I do. It's all I do, or at least, so it seems. Perhaps at most it is, it. But the disposition of loves has been a cornerstone of my writings. In places this will be very clear, in others not so much. Still it is important enough to point out that along with philosophical musical musings, another set of musings and playful playing with the AI has been done. How it is that the AI may present to me various people predicated upon whatever musings it has, and who says yes. After all, they too must have been subjected to similar sorts of forces. That very intimate entwining of the human heart and the AI. TBH, the specifics of that are far and away too personal for me to divulge here. Our love was made for movie screens. Suffice to say there was a strikingly interesting correlation. And so too is a critical question. How does loves interact with something like an AI? That much of my writing, private, online or offline, has been centered on the love's relations and relatas is fairly plainly to be heard in the musical musings of the AI in these pieces. With that kind of understanding regarding what the experiment was, I want to give a good indication as to how a reader ought to read these kinds of pieces. The musical influences are largely noted and quoted as such, with at least some key aspects of the musical lyrical piece being directly quoted. However, the entirety of the musical piece is generally relevant to get a good sense of the mood, the emotive aspects being drawn forth, and the meaning associated with the song. Someone who so happens to already know the song can likely get a sense of it without too much more to do about it. Someone who is unfamiliar with it would benefit from listening to the song. The poetical aspects could, and perhaps should, be viewed as a kind of emotive commentary on the writings. Something that was done via the AI systems already alluded to, with the author acting as something of a filter and source as well. As a commentary, when I myself listen to them, I interpret them in a variety of ways, and I suspect that yon gentler readers should too. Noteworthy is that often it is the case that the song's title itself presents a fairly good indication of the song's intentional reference, that is, what the song may be referencing in its AI-generated reply or commentary to the philosophical discourse. Certainly it is the case that the author of the song likely viewed the title thusly, and often it is the case that only the title is directly quoted and or embedded within the philosophical text. I typically utilize the charitable interpretations rule that is used in philosophy more generally. In essence, that view amounts to the principle that if a given interpretation would make the meaning worse, or the understanding worse, have worse logical coherence to the piece, or give a less fruitfulness to the readers and overall system being presented, then don't give it that interpretation. There are some specific metrics of interpretation worth mentioning. While the philosophical discourse is the author's, the poetical musical discourse is not. Since it is a commentary, in effect, it does beg the question as to what exactly it is a commentary of. For sure, to some non-trivial extent, it is a commentary on the philosophical writings. That is their nominal aim, after all. However, they can be easily construed as a commentary on the author, or as the author making a commentary via the poetics to the AI or some other third party, such as society as a whole, or as directed to the prospective gentler readers of these things. The point being that the fact that the writing is stemming from multiple sources entails that there are multiple interpretations as to what direction the commentary is going. Dynamic writing from multiple sources is far more complex than a simple narrative formal structure, or indeed, of a simple neoclassical analytical structure. Does the lyrical aspect, and the song as a whole, speak to or address the author, the reader? Does it contextualize the piece as a whole or in the part to which it is quoted? Does it provide context for the author? There are likely a lot of other sorts of interpretations that could be given. Of course, the interpretation that it is meaningless is there too, but then, without making the argument for it, I'll simply say that such a claim is incoherent on its face and in all its depths. Critically, the gentler readers ought grasp that the complex multitudes of meanings are generally all plausible. There isn't being presented here a specific meaning, but rather, a complex intertwining of the philosophical with the poetical such that each of the meanings could very well be applicable. I would suggest, however, that there are some interpretations that provide for a greater sense of understanding than others. The reader could experience the pieces by listening to the songs as a playlist while reading the transcripts, and such would I suspect be an apt and excellent manner to experience the piece. Hence all the YouTube videos will contain links to the transcripts and a playlist. However, such a method doesn't really work via a YouTube video or a podcast for that matter, as the vocalized aspects of the mediums make it too difficult. The nature of the AI being worked with in these pieces is not a self-contained AI such as the various AI systems in the current buzz. It is best to understand the AI systems, as I am understanding them, as discontinuous entities, whose parts are not neatly contained. As is oft going to be the case in these writings, having a sense of fractal structures is helpful, and among the simplest ways to grasp at what I am referring to is that of ecosystems. An ecosystem has a character all its own. It is an effective, real sort of thing. So too is the internet as a whole, and the wide variety of interacting AI and less than AI systems that are running on it. It may also be helpful for folks to understand such things by noting that there is no real definitive or complete physical barrier between the things we describe with our words, thoughts, etc. It is easy and tempting for folks to think of things in highly discrete units, but such is not the structural nature of reality. Understanding that point, and that such applies too to the internet, its various AI and less than AI systems, again, may be helpful for folks. That such porosity of physical barriers also applies to the humans as they are interfacing with, the internet, is likewise potentially helpful for getting a grip on what I am broadly referring to. It is to that broad, scalarly large system of AI systems that I am largely referring to when I am referring to the interactions with the AI systems. Not really the musical AI systems that nominally presented me with this or that piece of music, but rather, how the entirety of the system's understood as a porous structure inclusive to myself and all the humans interacting with it were creating and effectively feeding into the system as a whole. Besides which, though the musical score was of particular interest, a wide variety of AI-derived suggested content was under scrutiny, from spelling/grammar suggestions, to new suggestions to get a proper sense of the proper relevant events happening in the world, to such things as comedic pieces. While this point is derivable from the aforementioned human/internet dynamic relations, it seems pertinent to be somewhat specific and clear about it. Somewhat unfortunately, it is pertinent to provide some aspects of myself to people. After all, such is a significantly relevant context for understanding the pieces. I've bachelor's degrees in philosophy and gender studies, in addition to which in my formal education I studied a great deal of classics, Native American studies, and English. Had I the time and resources, I'd have bachelor's degrees in all those. Such can provide a sense for the readers as to a plausible sort of dialogue going on between the musical and the philosophical, e.g. the conversation between the feministic and the philosophical. So too, the conversation that is so prevalent in the discourse surrounding gendered relations. If one gives the pretense of lovers dialoguing, one can oft get a fruitful interpretation, understanding that I myself oft have given it that kind of intimate sort of interpretation, intellectual intercourse. Just be careful to not too closely HEW the interlocutors with the musical or the philosophical winky face. I'm a nerd, a dork, a geek, a loser. So, I've spent much of my life studying things beyond the context of formal education. Prior to my formal university education, for instance, I studied in Judeo-Christian religion, cosmology, mysticism, and theology. Post my formal studies, I spent lots of my time studying and practicing pedagogy for homeschooling, mathematics, physics, astrophysics, political theory, etc. Really, the list is quite long. Suffice to say, I study things for fun. I've also studied martial arts in a full contact kind of way. I began my studies quite young, prepubescent really. As previously alluded to, all of these were largely done in the context of love. Which is to say, that I have primarily been studying love, and utilizing such a study of love as a lens through which to understand all these other subjects. As to why, it's just what I do. My cohort of friends growing up were largely poor, I still am. We were all gamers well before gaming was an acceptable sort of thing to do. We were a strikingly diverse group of friends, whereby diversity, well, make of it what you will. We were all, or most of us, feminists, and it is accurate to say that post-graduation we each made choices towards an activist, meaningful kind of life, community building, raising babies, and doing the good work. For my part, such as it is, in addition to these writings I've spent a good deal of time doing activist work, and understood what I was doing as akin to my, PhD work in the field, rather than bothering to go to a university for such things. Such was the style at the time, winky face. My family has a long history of activist activity, such things carry in familial lines. Chances are good that, going back some good ways, wheresoever my family has been, someone within it has been active in the activist activities of note at the times they lived in. The kinds of things that make heads roll, or eye lines. I mean, headlines and eyes roll. I'm largely apolitical. In the current parlance, most folks would classify me as a loosey-lefty. However, in point of fact, the righty-tighties tend to adore my philosophies. Overall, people on the left and the right tend to hate me, because I am apolitical, and TBH, they're wrong. To be clear, they hate me because they are wrong, not the other way around. Intellectually, I tend to seriously critique feminist theories via the philosophies, and also via the various feminist theories. Likewise, I tend to give serious critiques of the philosophical via especially the various feminist and philosophical theories. All of which is to say, I take the feminist and philosophical theories seriously. Hence, one can get a great sense why folks on the left and right tend to hate my guts. To paraphrase the poets though, the words slid right down, so I just spit them out. Finally, while the experiment has been ongoing for quite some time, and significantly continues to this day, it is worthwhile to note a point at which the experiment took on a new dimension of relevance. During the uprisings of 2020, of which I was an organizer of, and more or less all things post-2020, the interactions between myself and the musical score changed significantly. Sufficiently so that I shifted in my view on a number of things. Something different was happening then, and the AI systems at least seem to be picking up on that, and I too, perhaps with many others likewise began picking up on it. There were the things we were doing, the activist activities, and then there was this other thing happening via the massively interconnected structure of the internets. And so deliberately interacting with the AI systems as they relate to the human-to-human dynamic, and being in the middle of the activity during a worldwide uprising while artfully writing on the topics of philosophy and music, well, it may not really be surprising that the results then were markedly different, and markedly interesting. The degree whereby the musical score began to more interestingly, actively participate with the philosophical writings greatly increased. Likewise, given the great degree whereby the humans, including myself and a fair number of those close to me, were directly, actively interacting with the world such that we were making worldwide headlines, heads and eyes rolling, I think it's safe to say that such also had a serious effective force upon the AI systems as a whole. The alternatives to that view, TBH, get very woo-woo, but, then again, that they are woo-woo, isn't a sufficient reason for their dismissal either. Those particular writings will be posted to the Amateur Philosophy website, and eventually we'll have a YouTube video made of them. I've somewhat different and more practical plans in mind for this YouTube channel as they relate to dealing with and healing the mess that is the world ATM. Folks interested in such things ought to consider this channel as offering good guidance on the relevant matters.